David Chen stared out the window of his corner office on the 20th floor. Below him, tiny figures moved around the parking lot of his manufacturing plant. From up here, they looked like ants. He had no idea that in 2 weeks he would be one of those ants and his entire world would change forever. The reports on his desk painted a grim picture. Employee satisfaction scores were at an all-time low. Productivity had dropped 15% in the last quarter. Theft was up. People were calling in sick more often. The HR department was fielding complaints left and right, though most employees seemed too scared to speak up directly. David had built Chen Industries from the ground up over the past 12 years. What started as a small machine shop in his garage had grown into a company with over 300 employees. He was proud of what he had accomplished, but lately, something felt wrong. The energy in the building had shifted. The spark was gone. His phone buzzed. It was Richard, his operations manager. "David, we need to talk. The floor supervisors are reporting more problems. People aren't meeting their quotas. Some of the newer hires aren't even lasting a week. Yesterday, 3 people just walked out during their lunch break and never came back." David rubbed his temples. This was becoming a weekly conversation. "What do you think is going on?" "Honestly, I think we're hiring the wrong people. The younger generation doesn't want to work hard anymore. They expect everything handed to them. Maybe we need to be more selective in our hiring process." After hanging up, David leaned back in his leather chair. He had worked hard his entire life. When he was growing up, his family didn't have much money. His father worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. David remembered helping in his dad's small repair shop after school, learning the value of honest work and dedication. But maybe Richard was right. Maybe the problem was that today's workers just didn't have the same work ethic. They wanted high pay for minimal effort. They complained about everything instead of just doing their jobs. The more David thought about it, the more frustrated he became. He had given these people jobs, good jobs, jobs that paid decent wages in a town where decent jobs were hard to find. And this was how they repaid him? By slacking off and complaining? That afternoon, David called an emergency meeting with his management team. Around the polished conference table sat Richard, Linda from HR, Tom from finance, and Patricia, his assistant who had been with the company since the early days. "I want to know what's really happening on the factory floor," David said. "The numbers don't lie, something is wrong, and I need to understand what it is." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Well, we could conduct more employee surveys, or maybe hold some focus groups." "We've tried that," David said, waving his hand dismissively. "People either don't participate or they just tell us what they think we want to hear. I need real information. I need to see what's actually happening." Tom adjusted his glasses. "What are you thinking?" David had been wrestling with an idea for days. It seemed crazy, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. What if I went undercover? What if I worked on the floor for a couple of weeks as a regular employee? The room fell silent. Patricia was the first to speak. "David, that's a really risky idea. What if someone recognizes you?" "Most of the floor workers have never seen me up close. I usually only interact with supervisors and managers. And if I change my appearance a bit..." Richard shook his head. "I don't like it. There are too many variables. What if something goes wrong?" But David's mind was already racing. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that this was exactly what he needed to do. How else could he really understand what was happening? Reports and meetings only told part of the story. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. "I'm going to do it," he said firmly. "Linda, I need you to create a fake identity for me. Someone looking for work. Make it realistic." Over the next few days, David threw himself into planning his undercover mission. He studied the employee handbook like he had never seen it before. He researched the typical backgrounds of his workers. He even drove through the neighborhoods where most of his employees lived, trying to understand their lives outside of work. The transformation began with his appearance. David's usual wardrobe consisted of expensive suits and Italian leather shoes. For his undercover role, he bought cheap jeans, work boots, and plain t-shirts from a discount store. He let his normally perfectly groomed hair grow out a bit and practiced speaking in a more casual way. Linda created a complete backstory for his fake identity. His name would be Mike Rodriguez. He was 38 years old, recently laid off from a construction job in the next town over. He had some experience with machinery, but was willing to learn. He needed the work because he had rent to pay and was supporting his elderly mother. David rented a small apartment in the neighborhood where many of his employees lived. The place was a far cry from his suburban mansion. The walls were thin, the appliances were old, and the parking lot was cracked and full of potholes, but it was authentic, and that's what mattered. The hardest part was explaining his absence to his family. David told his wife that he was going on an extended business trip to evaluate potential new locations for the company. She wasn't happy about the timing, but she understood that the business was going through a rough patch. On his last night before starting his undercover assignment, David stood in his home office looking at family photos and awards from various business organizations. Tomorrow, all of this would be temporarily behind him. Tomorrow he would be just another guy looking for work, trying to make ends meet. He was confident that his plan would work. He would spend 2 weeks on the factory floor, identify the problem employees, and figure out why productivity was down. Maybe he would catch people stealing or sleeping on the job. Maybe he would discover that some of his supervisors weren't doing their jobs properly. What David didn't expect was that his 2 weeks undercover would completely shatter everything. He thought he knew about his company and the people who worked for him. He had no idea that the real problem wasn't lazy employees or poor work ethic. The real problem was much closer to home than he could have ever imagined. As he set his alarm clock for 5 in the morning, David felt excited about his secret mission. He was about to learn the truth about his company. But the truth he would discover was not at all what he expected, and it would change not just his business but his entire understanding of what it means to be a leader. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning. David's eyes shot open in the dark, cramped bedroom of his temporary apartment. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality hit him. Today was the day he would become Mike Rodriguez, factory worker. David had never gotten up this early for work in his life. As a CEO, his typical day started around 8:30 with coffee and emails, but factory workers started at 6, which meant he needed time to get ready and drive to the plant. The cold water from the apartment's ancient shower head felt like needles against his skin. There was no fancy body wash or expensive shampoo here, just a bar of soap that he had bought at the dollar store. David looked at himself in the cracked bathroom mirror. The man staring back at him looked tired and ordinary. Perfect. He drove to the factory in a beat-up Honda that he had bought from a used car lot for $3,000. The car rattled and shook, and the radio only picked up static. David realized he had never really noticed how many old cars were in his company's parking lot. From his office window, the parking lot just looked like a sea of metal. Now he understood that each of those cars represented someone struggling to make ends meet. At the employee entrance, David joined a line of people waiting to clock in. Most of them looked tired. Some were drinking coffee from travel mugs that had seen better days. A few were smoking cigarettes, trying to get in one last puff before their shift started. David had used the executive entrance for so many years that he had forgotten this entrance even existed. The area was poorly lit and the concrete was cracked and stained. There was no comfortable seating, no coffee station, no pleasant decorations, just a time clock and a bulletin board covered with company notices that no one seemed to read. "You the new guy?" asked a woman behind him. She looked to be in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and hands that showed years of hard work. "Yeah, first day," David replied, trying to sound nervous, which wasn't hard because he actually was nervous. "I'm Betty. Been here 11 years. What's your name?" "Mike Rodriguez," Betty smiled. "Well, Mike, stick close to me today. The first day can be overwhelming. The supervisors sometimes forget that new people don't know everything yet." David was touched by her kindness. When was the last time someone had offered to help him without wanting something in return? After clocking in, David followed Betty to the main factory floor. The noise hit him like a wall. Machines hummed, metal clanged against metal, and forklifts beeped as they moved materials around. The air smelled of oil and hot metal, David had walked through the factory before during official tours, but he had always worn ear protection and stayed a safe distance from the actual work. Now he was in the middle of it, and it was overwhelming. "You'll get used to the noise," Betty shouted over the din. "After a while, you don't even notice it." David was assigned to work in the packaging department, where finished products were prepared for shipping. His supervisor was a man named Carlos, who looked stressed and tired despite the early hour. "Okay, Mike, here's what you need to do," Carlos said quickly. "Take the parts from this conveyor belt, check them against this list, put them in the correct boxes, seal the boxes, and put them on the pallet. We need to package 200 units per hour. Think you can handle that? 200 units per hour. That meant 1 unit every 18 seconds. David nodded confidently. How hard could it be? Very hard, as it turned out. The parts were heavier than they looked. David's soft office hands, accustomed to nothing more strenuous than typing on a keyboard, began to ache within the first hour. The boxes were awkward to handle, and the packaging tape dispenser seemed designed to fight against him. But the real challenge was the pace. 18 seconds per unit sounded reasonable in theory, but in practice, it was relentless. There was no time to rest, no time to stretch, no time to think about anything except the next unit, the next box, the next item on the list. By the first break, David's back was screaming in pain. His hands were cramping. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the fact that the factory wasn't particularly warm. "How are you holding up?" Betty asked during their 15-minute break. "It's harder than I expected," David admitted. "You'll get stronger," she said encouragingly. "We all did. I remember my first week. I thought I was going to die." During the break, David looked around at his co-workers. They were talking quietly, sharing snacks, checking their phones. Some looked exhausted, but they also looked normal. These weren't the lazy troublemakers he had expected to find. They were just regular people doing their jobs. The second half of the morning was even worse than the first. David fell further and further behind the required pace. Carlos had to keep coming over to help him catch up, which clearly frustrated the supervisor. "Look, Mike, I like you, but you've got to pick up the pace," Carlos said during one of these interventions. "Management is all over us about productivity numbers. If this line doesn't hit its targets, we all hear about it." David wanted to tell Carlos that he was doing his best, but he was too out of breath to speak. His legs felt like jelly. His shoulders burned. He had never been so physically exhausted in his life. During lunch break, David sat alone at a cafeteria table, trying not to collapse. The food was nothing like the catered meals he usually enjoyed in executive meetings. It was basic, institutional food that tasted like it had been sitting under heat lamps for hours. But David was so hungry that he ate every bite. He watched his co-workers during lunch. Many of them brought their own food in brown bags or plastic containers. They ate quickly, not savoring their meals but just fueling up for the afternoon shift. Some people didn't eat at all, just sat quietly with their eyes closed, trying to rest. David overheard conversations at nearby tables. People talked about their kids, their bills, their weekend plans. One woman mentioned that she was working a second job at a grocery store to make ends meet. A man complained that his car needed new tires, but he couldn't afford them until next month. These were not the conversations David was used to hearing. In his world, people talked about vacation homes and stock options and golf tournaments. Here, people talked about survival. The afternoon was a blur of pain and exhaustion. David's productivity got worse instead of better. His hands developed blisters that made every movement painful. His back seized up so badly that he could barely bend over to pick up the boxes. But what shocked him most was the equipment he was working with. The conveyor belt was old and temperamental. It would speed up and slow down without warning, making it impossible to maintain a steady rhythm. The packaging tape dispensers were cheap and poorly maintained. They jammed constantly, wasting precious seconds that David couldn't afford to lose. The boxes themselves were often damaged or the wrong size. When David pointed this out to Carlos, the supervisor just shrugged. "We use what we get," Carlos said. "Corporate says these boxes are good enough." David realized with horror that he was the corporate that Carlos was referring to. These decisions had probably crossed his desk at some point, and he had approved them without thinking about how they would affect the people actually doing the work. As the end of his first shift approached, David felt like he had run a marathon. Every muscle in his body ached. His hands were raw and bleeding, his feet were swollen in his cheap work boots. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. The worst part was the dawning realization that he had been completely wrong about his employees. These people weren't lazy. They were working incredibly hard under conditions that David wouldn't have believed if he hadn't experienced them himself. When the shift end bell finally rang, David practically crawled to the time clock. Betty appeared beside him, still looking fresh despite having worked the same brutal shift. "Not bad for a first day," she said kindly. "You'll feel better tomorrow." David doubted that very much. As he walked to his beat-up Honda, he noticed that many of his co-workers were getting into cars that were even older and more beat up than his temporary vehicle. Some were walking to a bus stop across the street. Driving home, David's hands shook on the steering wheel. He had always prided himself on being a hands-on leader, someone who understood his business from top to bottom. But today had proven that he didn't understand anything at all. That night, as David soaked his aching body in the apartment's tiny bathtub, he realized that tomorrow he would have to do it all over again. And the day after that. And the day after that. This wasn't a one-day experiment anymore. This was reality for hundreds of people who depended on him for their livelihoods. For the first time since starting his company, David began to question everything he thought he knew about leadership, about business, and about the people who had made his success possible. By his fourth day on the factory floor, David's body was starting to adapt to the physical demands of the work. His hands were still sore, but the blisters had hardened into calluses. His back still ached, but he could bend and lift without wanting to cry out in pain. What he wasn't prepared for was how much he was starting to care about the people around him. Betty had taken him under her wing, teaching him shortcuts and techniques that made the work more manageable. She showed him how to stack boxes more efficiently, how to fix the temperamental tape dispenser when it jammed, and how to pace himself so he wouldn't burn out before lunch. "The secret," she told him during one of their breaks, "is to find a rhythm. Don't fight the work, just flow with it." David found himself looking forward to these conversations with Betty. She had a wisdom that came from years of experience, not just with the job but with life. She talked about her grown children, her grandchildren, and her husband who had passed away 3 years earlier. "He worked here too," she said one day, pointing to a machine across the floor. "Operated that press for 22 years. Never missed a day of work unless he was in the hospital." "That's impressive," David said. "He loved this place," Betty continued. "Always said that Chen Industries was a good company to work for. Fair wages, steady work, not like some of the other factories around here that treat people like dirt." David felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. Pride that his company had earned that reputation, but guilt because he was learning firsthand that things weren't as good as he had thought. On his 5th day, David was moved to a different department to help with a rush order. He found himself working alongside a young man named Alex who couldn't have been more than 22 years old. Alex worked with an intensity that amazed David, never slowing down, never complaining, always focused on the task at hand. During lunch, David sat with Alex and learned his story. Alex was supporting his younger sister while she went to college. Their parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and Alex had dropped out of school to take care of his sister. "I know this isn't forever," Alex said, eating a sandwich that looked like it was mostly peanut butter and not much else. "But right now, this job is everything. My sister is studying to be a nurse. She's really smart, smarter than me. I just need to keep us going until she graduates." David was moved by Alex's maturity and dedication. Here was a young man who had given up his own dreams to support his family, and he was doing it without bitterness or self-pity. "What did you want to study?" David asked. "Engineering," Alex said with a small smile. "I love figuring out how things work, how to make them better. Actually, I've been thinking about some improvements we could make to the line I work on. There's a bottleneck where the parts come together, and I think I know how to fix it. Have you told anyone about your ideas? Alex laughed, but there was no humor in it. Who would I tell? The supervisors are too busy putting out fires to listen to ideas from a floor worker. And the managers, well, they don't exactly ask for our opinions. This hit David like a punch to the gut. Here was an employee with engineering knowledge and practical experience who had ideas that could improve efficiency, but there was no system in place for him to share those ideas. That same week, David met Rosa, a woman in her 30s who worked in the quality control department. Rosa had been with the company for 8 years and knew more about the products than most of the engineers. She could spot defects that would slip past the automated systems, and she had an intuitive understanding of what customers needed. I've been trying to get promoted to supervisor for 3 years, Rosa told David during one of their conversations. I've applied every time there's an opening, but they always hire someone from outside, usually someone with a college degree, but no experience with our actual products. That must be frustrating, David said. It is, Rosa admitted. I love working here, and I know I could help train new people, help improve our processes. But sometimes I feel invisible, you know? Like my experience doesn't count for anything. David was beginning to see a pattern. His company was full of talented, dedicated people who had valuable insights and ideas. But there was no way for those insights to reach the people who made decisions. The management structure he had created was like a wall between the executives and the workers. The most eye-opening conversation came during his second week, when David was eating lunch with a group of workers who had been with the company for years. They were talking about recent changes in company policy, and David realized they knew more about the financial challenges facing the business than he had given them credit for. The health insurance costs are killing us, said one worker. I heard they might have to cut benefits again. Better than losing jobs, said another. Remember what happened at Peterson Manufacturing? They closed down overnight, 300 people out of work. Chen Industries won't do that, said a third worker confidently. This company cares about its people. Always has. David felt a knot in his stomach. These people trusted him to take care of them, to make decisions that considered their welfare. But how could he make good decisions if he didn't really understand their lives? As the days went on, David began to notice things that he had never seen before. He saw how the workers helped each other when someone was struggling. When an older employee named Frank started falling behind on his quota due to arthritis in his hands, his coworkers quietly picked up the slack without being asked. He saw how people shared resources. When someone forgot their lunch, others would share their food. When someone's car broke down, coworkers would offer rides. There was a sense of community and mutual support that David had never experienced in the executive offices. But he also saw the stress that financial pressure put on these families. He heard phone conversations during breaks where people were trying to arrange payment plans for medical bills or negotiate with landlords about late rent. He saw the exhaustion on faces of people who were working multiple jobs just to get by. One evening, as David was leaving the factory, he overheard Rosa talking to Betty about her son's school supplies. The list keeps getting longer every year, Rosa was saying, and more expensive. I don't know how they expect working parents to afford all this stuff. Check with the school counselor, Betty suggested. Sometimes they have programs to help. I already did. We make too much money to qualify for assistance, but not enough to actually afford everything. David walked to his car, thinking about that conversation. Rosa was a skilled worker who had been with the company for 8 years, but she was struggling to buy school supplies for her child. Something was very wrong with that picture. That night, David sat in his small apartment and did something he had never done before as a CEO. He calculated what his workers actually took home after taxes, after health insurance premiums, after all the deductions. Then he looked up the cost of rent in the neighborhoods where they lived, the cost of groceries, the cost of childcare. The numbers were sobering. Many of his employees were living paycheck to paycheck despite working full-time for a profitable company. They weren't asking for luxuries. They were asking for the basic dignity of being able to support their families without having to choose between medical care and school supplies. David began to understand that the problems at his company weren't caused by lazy workers or poor attitudes. They were caused by a system that treated people as expenses rather than assets, that valued short-term profits over long-term relationships, that made decisions in boardrooms without considering their impact on real families. As he prepared for his final few days undercover, David realized that his mission had completely changed. He was no longer looking for employees to fire or problems to fix with discipline. He was looking for ways to build the kind of company that his workers thought they were already working for. The people on the factory floor weren't just employees. They were the heart and soul of his business. They were the ones who made his success possible, and it was time he started treating them that way. But first, he had to figure out how to tell them who he really was without destroying the trust he had begun to build. Because tomorrow, he would have to make a choice that would change everything. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning during David's 10th day undercover. He was working his usual station in the packaging department when he heard a loud crack followed by screaming from across the factory floor. A hydraulic press that David had personally approved for continued operation pending replacement had finally given out. The safety guard had failed and a worker named Tony was trapped with his arm caught in the mechanism. David's first instinct was to run over and take charge, to use his authority as CEO to coordinate the emergency response. But he caught himself just in time. He was Mike Rodriguez, a temporary worker with no authority to do anything except what everyone else was doing, standing frozen in shock. Carlos, the floor supervisor, was shouting into his radio, trying to get maintenance and medical help. Other workers had shut down nearby machines to reduce the noise. Betty was on her knees next to Tony, talking to him in a calm voice, trying to keep him conscious while they waited for help. "Hang in there, Tony," she was saying. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay." David watched in amazement as his employees responded to the crisis. Without being asked or directed, people stepped up to help. Alex had grabbed a first aid kit and was assisting Betty. Rosa was directing other workers to clear a path for the paramedics. An older worker named Frank was directing traffic in the parking lot to make sure the ambulance could get through. But what struck David most was the complete absence of management. No executives appeared on the scene. No one from the corporate offices came down to check on Tony or coordinate the response. The workers were handling the entire emergency themselves. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked quickly to free Tony and stabilize his arm. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, David could see that the injury was serious but not life-threatening. Tony would need surgery, but he would recover. As the ambulance pulled away, a manager David didn't recognize appeared on the factory floor. He was wearing a clean suit and carried a clipboard. Instead of asking about Tony's condition or checking on the other workers, his first question was about production schedules. "How long until we can get this line running again?" The manager asked Carlos. "Sir, we need to investigate what happened," Carlos replied. "The press has been acting up for weeks. We've filed multiple maintenance requests." "Well, that's a problem for later," the manager said dismissively. "Right now I need to know when we can resume production. Corporate is expecting this order to ship today." David felt his blood pressure rising. A man had just been seriously injured, and this manager's only concern was production quotas. But what made him even angrier was the realization that this manager was probably just following policies that David himself had established. For the rest of the shift, the mood on the factory floor was somber. People were shaken by what they had witnessed, and rumors were spreading about Tony's condition. David learned from conversations around him that this wasn't the first time equipment failures had led to injuries. "Remember when the ventilation system broke down last summer?" one worker said. 3 people passed out from the heat before they finally fixed it. "Or when the loading dock ramp collapsed," said another. "If Jerry hadn't jumped out of the way, he could have been killed." David felt sick. How had he not known about these incidents? Surely they had been reported to management, but somehow the information had never reached him in a way that conveyed the urgency of the safety problems. During lunch break, David sat with his usual group. But the conversation was different today. People were angry and frustrated, and for the first time, they were openly critical of management. "They don't care about us." Alex said bitterly. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet. As long as we keep producing, they don't care if we get hurt. That's not fair, Betty said gently. Some of the managers are good people, and Mr. Chen built this company from nothing. He's not like those corporate types who only care about profits. David's chest tightened. Even now, even after what had happened, Betty was defending him. She still believed in the company, still believed in him, even though he was failing her and everyone else. Have you ever met Mr. Chen? Rosa asked Betty. No, but I've heard he's a good man. Patricia in his office always says nice things about him when she comes down here. I heard he makes more in a month than we make in 10 years, Alex said. So, he built the company. He should make good money, Betty replied. I just wish he knew what was really happening down here. I bet if he knew about the safety problems, he'd fix them right away. David had to excuse himself from the table. He couldn't sit there and listen to Betty defend him when he knew how badly he had let her down. He walked to the restroom and stared at himself in the cracked mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger. 2 weeks ago, he had been confident, successful, proud of what he had built. Now he felt like a fraud. After work, David did something he had never done before. Instead of going straight home, he followed some of his co-workers to a small diner across town where they sometimes gathered after their shifts. He told himself he was just continuing his undercover research, but the truth was that he wasn't ready to be alone with his thoughts. The diner was the kind of place David would never normally enter. The vinyl booths were patched with duct tape. The coffee was weak and the menu was laminated and stained. But it was clean and friendly, and the prices were reasonable for people living on factory wages. David sat in a corner booth with Betty, Alex, Rosa, and Frank. The conversation eventually turned to Tony's accident, and David listened as his employees shared their real feelings about the company he had built. I love working at Chen Industries, Rosa said. It's better than a lot of places around here, but sometimes I feel like we're invisible, like the people making decisions don't even know we exist. The safety inspections are a joke, Frank added. They walk through with their clipboards, check off boxes, but they don't actually look at anything. That press has been making weird noises for months. I tried to report it, Alex said. Filled out 3 different forms. Never heard anything back. David's heart was breaking. These people were loyal to his company despite the way it was treating them. They wanted to help make things better, but the systems he had put in place were preventing their voices from being heard. What would you do if you were in charge? David asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Betty smiled sadly. I'd listen, she said simply. I'd come down to the floor and talk to people. Not for some fancy tour or photo opportunity, but really talk. Find out what we need, what problems we're having. I'd fix the equipment, before it breaks instead of after, Alex added. It would save money in the long run and it would keep people safe. I'd create a way for workers to share ideas, Rosa said. We see problems every day that could be fixed easily if anyone asked us. I'd make sure people felt valued, Frank said. Not just with money, though, that's important too, but with respect, with recognition for the work we do. David nodded, memorizing every word. These weren't complicated or expensive solutions. They were basic human needs: safety, respect, communication, recognition. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. David learned that Betty was struggling to pay for her husband's medical bills from his final illness. Alex was saving every penny he could for his sister's college expenses. Rosa was worried about her son, who was getting into trouble at school because she couldn't afford after-school programs. These weren't abstract problems. They were real people facing real challenges, and David was the one person who had the power to help them. But they didn't know that. To them, he was just Mike Rodriguez, a temporary worker who would probably move on to another job soon. When it was time to leave, Betty walked with David to the parking lot. Thanks for listening tonight, she said. Sometimes it helps to talk about these things with someone who understands. What do you mean? David asked. You're different from most of the temporary workers we get, she said. You actually care about people. You pay attention. Maybe you should think about applying for a permanent position. We could use more people like you around here. David drove home that night feeling like his world had been turned upside down. He had learned more about his company and his employees in 2 weeks than he had in 12 years as CEO. But more importantly, he had learned something about himself. He had become the kind of leader he would have hated when he was starting out. He had lost touch with the people who made his success possible. He had created systems that protected him from bad news instead of systems that solved problems. Tomorrow would be his last day undercover. He had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. The question wasn't whether to reveal his identity, but how to do it in a way that honored the trust these people had placed in him. Because Betty was right about one thing. The company did need more people like Mike Rodriguez. It needed leaders who listened, who cared, who understood that business success meant nothing if it came at the expense of human dignity. David Chen, the CEO, had failed his employees. But maybe Mike Rodriguez could help him become the leader they deserved. David's hands shook as he clocked in for his final day as Mike Rodriguez. He had spent most of the night rehearsing what he would say, how he would reveal his true identity without destroying the relationships he had built over the past 2 weeks. He had originally planned to work the full day and then tell his coworkers during the shift change, but when he arrived at his station and saw the empty spot where Tony usually worked, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The morning started like any other. Betty greeted him with her usual warm smile. Alex was already hard at work despite arriving, just minutes before, and Rosa was carefully inspecting products with the same dedication she showed every day. These people had become more than coworkers to David. They had become friends, and he was about to shatter their trust in the most devastating way possible. During the first break, David made his decision. He couldn't continue the deception for another minute. Can I talk to you guys about something? He asked Betty, Alex, Rosa, and Frank as they gathered in their usual spot. Sure, Mike, what's on your mind? Betty asked. David took a deep breath. There was no easy way to do this. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you react. My name isn't Mike Rodriguez, it's David Chen. I'm the CEO of this company. The silence that followed was deafening. David watched as confusion, then realization, then anger crossed their faces. Alex was the first to speak. You're kidding, right? This is some kind of joke? I wish it were, David said, quietly. I came here because I thought I had lazy employees who were dragging down productivity. I thought if I worked undercover for a couple of weeks, I could identify the problem workers and figure out how to fix the company's issues. Frank shook his head in disbelief. You've been lying to us this whole time? Yes, and I know how that must feel. But please, let me explain why. Betty's face had gone pale. All those conversations we had about management, about you, I defended you to your face while you were pretending to be someone else. The hurt in her voice was like a knife in David's chest. Betty, everything you said about believing in this company, about thinking I was a good person, that meant everything, to me. But it also showed me how wrong I was about everything. Rosa crossed her arms. So what happens now? You fire us for talking honestly about our jobs? You punish us for treating you like a human being instead of a boss? No, David said, firmly. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to apologize and to ask for your help in fixing what's broken. For the next hour, David told them everything. He explained how disconnected he had become from the day-to-day reality of his company. He talked about the reports and meetings that painted a picture completely different from what he had experienced on the factory floor. He admitted that he had failed as a leader and as a human being. I thought I was running a successful company, he said. I thought I was providing good jobs and treating people fairly. But I was wrong about everything. You've shown me what this company really looks like from the ground up, and I'm ashamed of what I've built. Alex spoke up, his voice still angry but less hostile than before. So what changes? You go back to your corner office and we go back to being invisible? No, David said. That's exactly what I'm not going to do. But I need your help. You know what's wrong and how to fix it. I need you to teach me how to be the kind of leader this company deserves. Over the following weeks, David began the most difficult transformation of his life. His first action was to visit Tony in the hospital, not as part of any public relations effort, but as a man who needed to apologize face-to-face for the safety failures that had led to the accident. Tony was surprised to see his CEO sitting beside his hospital bed, but he was even more surprised by David's humility and genuine remorse. "I know you have no reason to trust me," David told him, "but I want you to know that this will never happen again. Not to you, not to anyone." David's second action was to call an all-hands meeting for the entire company. Instead of speaking from behind a podium in the auditorium, he stood on the factory floor and told everyone about his 2 weeks undercover. The reaction was mixed. Some employees were angry about the deception. Others were skeptical that anything would really change, but many were hopeful that finally someone in leadership was listening. "I learned that this company's greatest asset isn't our equipment or our contracts," David told the assembled crowd. "It's all of you, and I've been wasting that asset by not listening to what you have to say." The changes began immediately. David established a new safety protocol where any worker could shut down any piece of equipment if they believed it was unsafe, with no questions asked and no repercussions. He created an employee suggestion system where ideas were reviewed by a committee that included both managers and floor workers. Betty was promoted to lead the new employee advocacy program, where she would serve as a liaison between workers and management. Alex was moved to the engineering department, where his ideas for improving efficiency were finally given the attention they deserved. Rosa became a supervisor in quality control, with the authority to implement the improvements she had been thinking about for years. But the most important change was cultural. David instituted monthly floor time where all managers, including himself, worked regular shifts alongside the employees. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a photo opportunity. It was a requirement, designed to keep leadership connected to the reality of the work being done. David also restructured the compensation system. He reduced his own salary by 30% and used the savings to increase wages for the lowest paid workers. He improved the health insurance plan and added benefits like paid family leave and childcare assistance. 6 months after his undercover experience, David stood once again at the window of his corner office, looking down at the parking lot. But now he saw something different. Instead of anonymous figures moving around like ants, he saw Betty walking to her car after another successful day mediating between workers and management. He saw Alex leaving the engineering building, probably heading home to help his sister with her nursing school studies. He saw Rosa getting into her newer car, the one she had been able to afford after her promotion and raise. The company's productivity had increased by 25%, not because people were working harder, but because they were working smarter. Safety incidents had dropped to nearly zero. Employee turnover had decreased dramatically, saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in training costs. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most to David. What mattered was the transformation in the culture of the company. People were engaged, committed, and proud of their work. They offered suggestions freely because they knew they would be heard. They took ownership of problems because they knew they had the authority to solve them. David had learned that the secret to business success wasn't to squeeze every penny out of operations or to treat workers as replaceable resources. The secret was to create an environment where people could do their best work, where they felt valued and respected, where they had a stake in the company's success. 3 years later, Chen Industries was recognized as one of the best places to work in the state. The company had expanded, adding new product lines and creating hundreds of additional jobs. Business publications wrote articles about David's innovative management style and his commitment to employee welfare. But David knew the truth. He hadn't innovated anything. He had simply learned to listen to the people who had been trying to tell him how to improve his company for years. On the anniversary of his undercover experience, David did something that had become an annual tradition. He spent the entire day working on the factory floor alongside Betty, Alex, Rosa, and the others who had taught him what leadership really meant. At the end of the shift, as they gathered for their usual coffee at the little diner across town, Betty raised her cup in a toast. To Mike Rodriguez, she said with a smile, the temporary worker who taught our CEO how to be human. David raised his own cup, remembering the scared, disconnected man who had clocked in that first morning 2 weeks that felt like a lifetime ago. To all of you, he replied, for showing me that the best leaders aren't the ones who have all the answers. They're the ones who know how to listen to the people who do. As they talked and laughed around the worn table in the little diner, David realized that this was what success really looked like. Not corner offices or profit margins, but real relationships with real people who trusted him enough to tell him the truth, even when it was hard to hear. The Undercover CEO had learned the most important lesson of his life, that leading people means serving them, not the other way around. And that lesson had transformed not just his company, but his understanding of what it means to build something truly worth having.